On Thursday of this week, while he was on his way to the G20 meeting, our president delivered what was almost immediately being called the worst speech ever delivered by an American president. It was delivered in Poland, and it sounded frighteningly like he was leading up to a marriage proposal for the first several minutes, but it became clear this wasn't really a presidential speech. This was a commercial. Trump recounted the horrors of Poland's history of invasions and occupations in the last century under the Nazis and then by the Russians. So he praised the courage and the sacrifice of the Poles who stood up to the Nazis and then the Soviets to regain and to maintain their independence and self-governance. And after whipping the crowds into cheering for themselves, their courage, their military resolve, then the sales pitch started. Like a good salesman, Trump praised the Poles for their great virtues and then identified it as having been accomplished by their having met the NATO goals for military spending, defense spending, and specifically for their recent purchase of American-made military missiles from the United States. Then he began to publicly shame the European nations, the leaders of which he would be meeting the next day in Germany. He shamed them for not loving their culture enough to defend it the way the Poles were doing, for not spending as much on defense for themselves. I don't know, from Nazis and Soviets, I guess. But of course, military spending by anyone, whether it's our enemies or our friends, anytime a government starts to spend more on military hardware, we sell more military hardware, and it increases the military-industrial complex in the United States. So it was a horrible speech. I mean, it was really poorly written and poorly delivered for an American president. But as a commercial goes, it was effective, just exactly what the military-industrial complex would have wanted. Like so much of what Trump does, it seems silly on the surface, but behind the curtain, it's all about the transfer of wealth from the middle and lower economic class into corporate profits, usually by cutting human services. Now, if you ever took an economics class in college, you're familiar with this guns and butter graph that economists like to use to describe military or describe a budget, a national budget. Guns, in a true economic sense, are not just military spending. It's any kind of capital investment, roads, bridges, water systems, national parks, but also nuclear weapons. Butter represents anything consumable, agricultural subsidies, education spending, food stamps, pensions, anything that's being immediately consumed is represented as butter. But now Trump's ideology makes things somewhat more literal. He wants America and Europe to stop spending so much money on education, pensions, food, housing, and to shift that money into buying more military hardware. But as our war in Afghanistan has been going on for more than 15 years, our longest military conflict in our history, and our attempts to untangle ourselves from the quagmire in Iraq, and it seems like even our involvement in Iraq is likely to spread into Syria and, God forbid, maybe even into Iran. The divergence of American resources to the machinery of war is impoverishing the rest of America. Now, why does military spending tend to grow both under Democrat and Republican administrations? We all know that the case for war in Iraq was totally fabricated. And while the 9/11 attacks were planned and rehearsed from caves and training camps in Afghanistan, you could hardly say that we were attacked by Afghanistan. It was a handful of people that found Afghanistan to be such a primitive place that they could hide out there. But we have spent trillions of dollars, we've lost thousands of soldiers' lives, and we have killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in Afghanistan and Iraq. Why? Why are we still there? What are we hoping to accomplish? And please forgive me if this seems just a little bit too cynical, but you can quickly see that if your ultimate goal, if your real military plan is to transfer wealth into the hands of corporations, nothing does that more effectively than military spending. If you spend $150,000 in your military budget, you create only one job. Most of it goes to profit. If you spend $150,000 in education or health care, you create 2 or more jobs. So it's half as effective. It costs more. So the profit is larger in the military spending. Now, Europeans look at this and they think, we need to spend more on education and health care. Creates more jobs, better for the economy, better for social services. Donald Trump looks at this and he wonders what he could do to militarize health care and public schools. Now, I would never argue against the necessity for a sane and realistic defense of our nation. I've got locks on my doors at home, and sometimes I lock the doors. Not always, but sometimes I do. But I don't have a minefield in the yard, and I don't have missile-armed drones flying around overhead. There is a rational and reasonable level of defense spending, and then there is wholesale robbery of the majority of the population in order to enrich the few. Now, of course, I'm not only concerned about the posture of military industrial complex spending in our economy. The laws of our nation are not written by the people who work in fast food restaurants. Laws are not written by the poor. Our tax system is designed by special interests from Wall Street investment banks, pharmaceutical companies, health insurance companies, and now even by the prison industry. I'm asking you, though, to just step back from the whole thing, take a wide-angle lens view of the American economy, and ask yourself, what is going wrong here? Now, this is what I would argue is at the heart of the problem. Our economy has grown over the past 2 generations, and yet as it has grown, a shockingly larger and larger percentage of the wealth has ended up in the hands of the top 1% of wage earners in America. The income disparity in the United States is much more than it is in other developed countries, and part of that is in Western democracies, in Europe, the government itself will buy stock in large corporations to influence the corporation's salary base and bonuses and to avoid the too big to fail situation that we find in the United States. But in America, the top 1% is not only in charge of the corporations, they are largely in charge of the government and in charge of the tax system, and so the resources keep going to them. As manufacturing jobs are increasingly either exported to third world countries where labor is cheaper or automated with robotic construction and automated manufacturing techniques, the labor pool available in the United States becomes increasingly too big for our needs. We just don't need as many workers as we have. That drives wages down. Class mobility, the ability to be born poor but to work your way into wealth, that was a larger issue in immigrants coming to America than ever what we were told in elementary school. It was much more common for people to be interested in class mobility than they were in religious freedom. The belief was that a poor person could come to these shores, and through hard work and perseverance, they could become a person of considerable wealth. That dream has increasingly become a fairy tale as class mobility in America is grinding to a halt. If you were born in poverty in the United States today, you have a 70% chance of dying in poverty. Those who left Ireland, England, Germany, Italy, Poland, and Greece to get out of a feudal economic system of the 19th century would now be better off if they went back to their nation of their heritage, where class mobility is, in fact, better than it is in America. In fact, if you are born poor in Denmark, you have twice as likely a chance of working your way out of poverty than you would be able to in America. The strong social supports afforded to citizens in socialist democracies in Western Europe make it possible for a person to work their way out of poverty, and their graduated tax structure that places a larger tax burden on top wage earners prevents the income disparity gap from growing to the extremes, the obscene extremes that we have in America today. Now, education is the single most important factor in future earning, so that countries with tuition-free universities are obviously going to be much better off than we are here in America, where higher education is becoming so expensive that it's literally unattainable to most of the poor. Universal health care, however, is an easy second in those reasons for greater class mobility in Western Europe. Again, an obvious factor where we are doing everything wrong while most of the developed economies of the world are pulling way out ahead of us, because a universal health care system allows you to change jobs, start a business, and know that you're going to be covered for health care. There are aspects of what economists now call the Nordic model that are not easy for Americans to accept. We are always afraid that someone is going to get something for nothing. It's somehow bred into us that Americans are nervous about anyone that might get something that we had to work for. Conservative talk radio and Fox News pundits are quick to blame all of our economic woes on the poor, whom they describe as the takers, while they think of themselves as the makers. Now, folks, you know me, I don't like to play the Nazi card all that often, but the ideology of the Nazis was to blame the Jews for the economic woes of the Germans when there was no real connection. But we're doing essentially the same thing by blaming people that are on food stamps or who need public housing or who need Medicaid. We are blaming them for the economic woes of the country while not looking at subsidies that we give to ExxonMobil or that we give to the military-industrial complex or General Electric, Morton Thiokol, General Dynamics, Boeing Aerospace. That's where the real welfare in our country is going, but we want, conservative politicians want you to get mad at the person in the grocery store line in front of you that's using food stamps.
Amen.
Conservatives reacted with visceral revulsion when President Obama and Senator Elizabeth Warren pointed out that successful business owners didn't really make their fortune all on their own, because they depended on a workforce that was educated in public schools. They benefited from roads and utilities, the police and fire services, all of which are provided to them at public expense. They participate in an economy that is regulated and stabilized that makes it possible for them to become wealthy. But somehow, they just don't want to believe that it's true. They've not only got mine, they've got yours too, and there is some sense of entitlement that they are owed your wealth. But the fact that they don't want to hear it doesn't make it any less true. Faced with the advancing mechanization of both agriculture and manufacturing, the transfer of wealth to the top will continue unless we put some guardrails up that keeps capitalism from running our nation into the ditch. Our democracy is at risk, specifically from income disparity. And we can either sit back and watch the rich write their own rules that destroys our nation, or we can get active enough to put up some guardrails and have an intelligent form of capitalism that serves the greater good. We have more labor than we need now. And for some reason, that has not translated into the fact that we could allow people to work fewer hours, and that we could distribute the fruit of our growing productivity in a way that allowed people to have a shorter work week, take more vacation time, and an earlier retirement, as happens in every other Western democracy. Now, our Protestant work ethic is admirable until it becomes lethal. And I think at this point in our economic history, our work ethic in some ways has become toxic to our country. We don't have to work 40 hours a week. We don't have to work 50 weeks a year. We don't have to keep working until we're 75 years old in order to produce what our nation needs to consume. We could go back to one-career households. We could raise our own children rather than farming them out to total strangers that are being paid minimum wage. I'm talking about creating a civilization that deserves to be defended. We've got this huge military machine that's defending a nation where we say we can no longer afford to give you health care, we can no longer afford to educate you, we can't take care of your kids. Well, what is an army for if it's not to defend something that's worth defending? We need to focus on creating a culture that is desirable, that honors our humanity. I'm not saying that we need to chain capitalism so that no one can get rich. I'm just saying that we have to restore sanity to the economic system. The 6 heirs of Sam Walton have accumulated more wealth than 100 million of the poorest Americans. 6 people. Now, that's not a picture of 100 million people. That's kind of hard to pull off. That's not even 1,000 people, but it's a lot of people, so you get my point. Sam Walton was really good at running a grocery store. He managed to pull off the retail business and was very successful. So maybe you could argue that his family ought to be rich. They somehow deserve to enjoy the fruits of his particular genius. But do they deserve so much wealth that it necessarily creates crushing poverty for 100 million people, creating hunger and disease and homelessness and human misery while we live in the presence of so much abundance? Of course not. And we need not allow ourselves to accept that just because the super wealthy have written a tax structure for themselves that serves them, that we all have to just accept it and live with it. And of course, I'm not just picking on the Walton family, though admittedly, that bunch is low-hanging fruit. But the larger reality is the 85 most wealthy people in the world who could comfortably be seated in this small room owns more than half of the world's wealth. 85 people. If we made those 85 people simply fabulously wealthy rather than obscenely and absurdly wealthy, there would be no more poverty. It could be done. Now, when I was at Harvard in 2004, I indulged my mild obsession with Søren Kierkegaard, and I took a long weekend and traveled to Copenhagen to see what I could find of the Great Dane's life. And there's not much there. There's a modest grave and a small room tucked away on the second floor of the City Museum that has his desk, a few pictures, Regine Olsen, of course, a couple of his coffee cups. But the largest display in the museum came as a real surprise to me. It had been set up as an educational display for young Danish students to teach them about the history of when there was poverty in Denmark, when they had hunger and homelessness, when the poor were sent to live on a poor farm before their society had evolved to its current state where everyone receives medical care, everyone has access to higher education, and there is no homelessness and there is no unemployment. I'll admit that memory of the poverty history of Denmark crowded out my enthusiasm for Søren Kierkegaard. I realized that ending poverty is not just something that preachers talk about and that others fantasize about. It's been done. It's a possibility. It's within our grasp. It seems far-fetched in a country where wealthy politicians are constantly looking for ways to cut Social Security, to end Medicaid, and always try to find ways to buy more guns and less butter. But you all know without any shade of doubt that it is morally wrong, that it's spiritually wrong, and that it is economically disastrous to allow this income disparity to go on. You don't need me to convince you that we need to focus on ameliorating suffering and poverty rather than creating absolutely obscene wealth at the top of the economic ladder. In the midst of the riots and demonstrations of the civil rights movement, then President John Kennedy very prophetically said that those who prevent peaceful revolution make violent revolution inevitable. America could not have continued to be America if we didn't bring that American racial apartheid to an end. But poverty has always been the subtext to racism in America. We ended, to some degree, the racial apartheid of America, but the class apartheid just got stronger. There are two Americas. And folks, there are not enough police in the world to maintain this division of wealth. We're a liberal church and we're not all that deeply invested maybe in biblical narratives, but surely I don't even have to remind you that it wasn't the gays and the poor liberals that Jesus kicked out of the temple. It was the bankers. It was the exploitative businesses that were making a mockery of what was sacred. And what was sacred was not the temple. It was the people. I believe that there's an inevitable revolution coming. And in this time of transformation, I really want to be on Jesus' side. And I hope you'll want to join me there. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.